What we're having today is we're doing an instructional video on lath and stucco on proper installation according to the ASTM standards required by the state of Florida. So to my left, I'd like to introduce everybody. To my far left is Paul Watson, our building official.
Thank you.
To immediate his right is Janelle Schmidley, and she is with GOBA, and her title is
Government and Industry Relations Advisor with Greater Orlando Builders Association.
And to my immediate left is Mike Starks.
Inspects. I'm a member of the C11 committee that writes the standards for ASTM. I'm a member of BOAF, which helps to govern the code. And I've been doing this for over 30 years. And I'm a stucco and masonry expert.
And we're so grateful that Mike can make it here today to help us put this joint video on, because this is an important part of construction of today and what we deal with, and how to install it properly and how to inspect it properly. So, and I am, last but not least, is Bob Pike. I am the Chief Building Plans Examiner for Seminole County, and now we will proceed to start our video. Okay, what we have here is a house that a contractor has provided for us. We won't name, of course, but we're going to start out with Mike here. He's going to go over the masonry part of proper installation of lath and stucco. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and he's going to take us through this house and start with the masonry, and then we'll work our way up to the frame portion. So with that, I turn it over to Mike.
Okay, so what we were going to do is to start with this house on this big block wall. We're going to do the first floor masonry, direct applied stucco, and go all the way around the house. Then we're going to come back and we'll go upstairs and we'll do the second floor framing and stucco over lath and accessories up there. So to begin with, my first impression here is I walked up and I see a lot of latents on the face of the block. This is a problem. So when you have a concrete block, and this one's a good example, all these tiny little fissures and holes in the face of this block create a mechanical key for the plaster. So when the stucco goes into that and it's wet, water is the catalyst in that, and it causes it to hydrate, creates a chemical reaction that grows a crystalline structure which locks all together into these little holes and holds the stucco on the wall. That's one of the bonds. The second bond is that the block will absorb the moisture and the cement paste out of the plaster and pull it into the face of that block about 1/4 of an inch, where as it cures, it locks everything together. So you have a chemical and a mechanical bond. All right, when they do this, it takes away your mechanical bond. So the standards require that this joint is just struck flush with the trowel. You don't tool it, you don't do anything to it, just cut it off with a trowel. This has been brushed. You can see the brush marks. All right, brushing, I don't have so much of a problem with brushing until you get to some place like this. This looks like it's been sponged. You can see it's filled in the face here. I've had walls where it was all this way. This isn't terrible, but it isn't great either. This will have to be cleaned by pressure washing and brushing before you can plaster that, or this will inhibit the bond of the stucco to the wall. So that's an issue. There's not a masonry apprenticeship program in the world that teaches that a sponge is part of a mason's tool bag, and so if he doesn't have it, he shouldn't be doing this. And it's specifically prohibited in the standards for stucco. So they should not be sponging or doing anything but cutting these joints flush. All right, that's number one. Secondly, we're going to talk about these penetrations. Any penetration through the building envelope, and that's any pipe or cable or anything comes through this wall behind the stucco. There's a penetration in the building envelope. So in this case, we have some plumbing pipes coming out here. This is pretty nice. I've not seen this done before. Most of the time, they just leave this sleeve open. Right, that's not good. But in this particular case, what needs to be sealed is this penetration back here. So typically, this has been drilled. It's a nice penetration, but typically you make it bigger than the protruding element so that it has room to move and expand and contract. But then when you plaster this, you either have to seal this first and then plaster, or if you plaster first, which really sealing it first is better, but if you plaster it first, then you got to cut the stucco back about 3/8 of an inch here, put a backer rod and sealant in it. If you've sealed it from this point before you put the stucco on, then you cut the stucco back and all you got to do is put a bead of sealant in it. And the same thing goes in all these penetrations. In this particular case, you want to cut the lath back 3/8 of an inch so that it doesn't touch this sleeve, because that sleeve is going to expand and contract at a much different rate than the plaster, and that's going to induce stress on the plaster coat when it's green and will cause cracks to radiate from these penetrations. So you want to cut this back. It does two things. It keeps the plaster away from it. It keeps it from expanding into the lath and pushing the lath. At the same time, where they've cut that lath, it's no longer galvanized, so it's exposed raw steel. So if you want that to be protected from rusting, then you have to encapsulate that in the plaster. So if you cut it back, then you're getting it encapsulated in the plaster, and you don't have to worry about it rusting. All right, same thing here. What they've done is they've come in with some expanded foam to create a backing for the stucco. This is one way of doing it, by putting that in there and then lathing it and plastering around it. You can also use a liquid applied or fluid applied sealant here, where you just take a trowel and you sponge it, you fill the hole and you sponge it and flatten it out around that, and that'll do it as well. They work very well also. I don't like these things where this cut lath is up against an electrical wire, simply because it can cut that wire and cause a short.
That's a code violation for the abrasiveness. Can I ask a question on the gas line here? We see the sleeve, PVC sleeve, and we have the metal gas line going into it. Now, when they go to stucco this, are they trying to put stucco between the pipe and the sleeve?
No,
that should
be sealed.
Should be sealed with sealant.
Should have a sealant, yeah.
Sealant
and the gas guy
pipe.
should have done that.
Right.
Yeah. So,
okay.
So yes, that should have a sealant in that sleeve as well.
Very good.
Okay. All right. The last item on this wall would be this foundation weep screed. So to begin with, the foundation weep screed is not required on masonry on solid bases, on any solid base, simply because water's not draining behind the stucco here anyway. This is a face barrier system. So you don't need this. The fact that they do it makes a nice, clean, architecturally clean looking finish, and that's good. You want to make sure this is at least an inch below the finished floor elevation. In this case, we know that it is, so that's good. And the only other thing is, anytime you have a joint in a butt, this is a butt joint, anytime you have a joint in accessories, well, all but one, these are required to be embedded in sealant. So you put the sealant up first, and then you squish the ends of it together in there, and that will embed it. In this particular case, because it's on solid base and it's on the solid concrete below the finished floor elevation, it's not going to make a big deal, and I would not fail an inspection over that. If that was over wood, I would.
Okay.
All right, continuing our discussion of penetrations, we have another one here. Electrical wiring coming through. The only issue I have with this one is just let's get this lath cut back a little bit away from the wire. So one, it doesn't cut the insulation or poke in, and two, it won't be affected by expansion and contraction. And let's get that sealed when they plaster it.
And Mike, they're going to cut that back. Should they
cut this back,
flash that in there as well?
If they can, they could go ahead and liquid flash it. You just take there's several brands of that stuff, and you trowel it on there, and it'll seal it. This is a very common issue you see in masonry walls. These basically they're gaskets that go over it to accommodate electrical outlets. And the only issue I have is typically the hole, and you can see it is here because they filled it. The hole they make for this, they beat with a hammer, and the hole is always way bigger than the outlet itself. So they put this over it, and it's perforated so that it will hold a plaster. Unfortunately, the hole still needs a backing for the plaster to stick to, because if you just fill it with stucco, it's not going to be watertight. So they come back and they fill them with this foam, and then the foam takes up the hole. So before they plaster this, they need to take this foam out of these holes so that the plaster will key in there. I use the term plaster and stucco intermittently. They are the same thing. There are different types of plaster. We're talking about Portland cement-based plaster. All right. So if you clean that stuff off of there, then this works good. This foam stuff makes it's not waterproof, but it is pretty well water resistant, and it makes a nice backer for the stucco when you force it in there. So
basically wanted to fill in the holes.
You want to fill in around,
and if there's
in the big hole in the masonry, you want to fill behind and around that. So, okay. Then the next item on the block wall is down here. This is a foundation weep screed. So the first comment about a foundation weep screed is, one, it's not required on masonry walls or solid bases, although it makes a nice finish trim piece. Stucco can actually go on solid bases below grade. I don't like doing that. I think this makes a nice, cleaner look to the house, and it's easier to convince, frankly, the inspectors that it's okay. But it's not necessary. But if you're going to do it, it should be below the finished floor level. So if the finished floor level was here, this is fine. If the finished floor level is right here, it should be a little lower. In this case, I know that they have a riser slab edge, so that the riser footer, so this is going to be fine where it is. You don't need it. The only other thing I would have comment about this is that joints in accessories are required to be embedded in sealant right here.
This is a butt joint.
It's a butt joint there.
It's okay to butt that, no laps required.
But it should have a sealant on it. Now, when we say embed, that typically means you put the sealant up there and squish the ends of it into it. Since this is on a masonry wall, this is not critical. It's not going to kill it. When you get to the framing parts of the house, this becomes a real point of entry for water. So we have to be real careful about that. And we'll point that out when we get around to it. Okay, so we've moved to the front of the house now, and I wanted to point out a few things here. This is a penetration through the wall. You can see there's a wire coming through there. It has a natural rubber gasket on it. It's probably fine. So really the only thing they need to do here is hold the stucco back, you know, 1/4 of an inch, and put a bead of sealant around that, and they'll be fine. This steel, expanding and contracting against fresh plaster, will cause it to crack if you stucco right up to it. All right, and then the next couple of items are, one is this is a corner bead. Now, corner bead are not required on solid bases. You almost have to have them when you have lath, but here they're not required. It makes it easier for the plaster to do this, but you could strip form this corner, and that's the way we used to do it in the old days, but we would use a strip form to do this, and then you'd have a solid corner instead of having this bead in it. These are faster, easier, they cost a little money, but they're a lot faster, and that's why the guys use them. But they are not required, they're not really necessary. Up here we have a decorative band over the garage door, and you can see they've done a couple things pretty well. You see this right here, this mitered corner? They snipped the inside, they snipped the attachment flange, and then they bent that around. Up at the top, however, they've got a mitered joint and it's a cut. This one should be up there and bent around, because that's where the water's going to get in, okay? So that's the one that should be bent around. If you were going to have one that was cut, it should be this one. All right. Secondly, anytime you use a plaster stop like this on the exterior, this top one should be angled down, and they make an angled casing bead specifically for this, because that's a shelf that holds water. If this was a frame wall, that would be more of a problem, because the water sitting on that shelf is going to tend to want to go backwards, and then it gets in behind the stucco. Because it's a masonry wall, in this particular case, it's on solid concrete on the pre-stress, or I'm sorry, a precast tie beam there. It's not going to cause a problem. Anytime you have stucco terminating horizontally, you want to use an angled plaster stop or casing bead
to shed the water off.
Plaster stop and casing bead are basically the same thing, depending on how you use them.
Right. So Mike, if water accumulates in there, that obviously it's going to be a problem for the stucco to continue to adhere there.
Well, it can cause stucco to debond over a long period of time. It's generally, in this case, in this location, not going to be a big issue.
Okay.
But it can be, but it's generally not.
So even though it's better to lap it over on the corner, it's not that big of a deal, or?
If this was over wire, I would insist on that one being the other way.
Okay, all right.
They've dropped it a little below the lip here, if you can see that, and that brings the drip edge. If water does gather in here, it's going to catch on here and it's going to drip out the back or the front, but it's not going to be up against this concrete. So. Since we're doing masonry first floor, let's go ahead and talk about this. We have an archway here, which is framed into a masonry opening. Now, the standard requires separation of dissimilar materials, and this typically would be dissimilar materials. However, what we found is these small archways like this that are inside of one panel of the plaster generally don't behave like they would if they were in a big wall area where they don't move and create cracks like that. If I were doing, now I happen to know what's going on the face of this wall, so if I was going to do this, I would continue my weather barriers all the way down here and not have that gap in between, so that you have a continuous weather barrier there behind the lath. And I would have done it that way.
And with that, Mike, you're meaning the felt paper.
I'm talking about the felt and the house wrap behind it.
Right.
They're both weather barriers. The one in the back is a primary, and the one in the front is a bond break.
Correct.
But water's going to run down both of them if it gets behind the stucco. So in this case, if it gets behind up there at that mid-wall weep screed, if it gets behind right there, it's going to go behind the papers down here, and it's going to be on the plywood.
It's going to be rotting out, and you don't know it.
So you want that, when you're doing this, if you're doing this and you have the same finish going, but you want a continuous barrier at that point.
Gotcha.
Okay. They've also done an arch bead here. This is a nice configuration. There's some new products coming out that will help. If you could, Kurt, if you could come back here and look at this from underneath and from this angle, it would help. So you have a plaster stop terminating the horizontal plaster from the vertical plaster. The plaster stop is drilled with larger holes so that it will weep, and it's also on a rake, so it's going to weep, and they've carried it over to the outside of the corner bead so that if water does get there, it can weep out. This is a code requirement configuration. You must have a weep screed on the face of that. That's a weather exposed surface on the outside face, and you have to have a weep mechanism for it, and you have to have a gap between the horizontal and the vertical, which will need to be sealed to keep bugs out of it. On the inside face here, you don't have a weather exposed surface. You still are required to separate the horizontal and the vertical. You can do that with 2 casing beads. They're doing it with, they're using a corner bead here. Not exactly right, but in this scenario, probably not going to be a big problem. The only thing I do see here is separating, this is vertical surface and that's a horizontal, and that has to be separated here, and it has to be isolated with a bead. This you cannot do. It will crack there if you do it that way.
So he has a couple options there. Can he groove it and seal it, or does he have to put an accessory there?
There needs to be an accessory there.
Okay, so at this point we need an accessory from the
plaster
vertical
stop across there.
to the horizontal, a plaster stop.
All right.
Okay.
Now on the inside face here, where it had this angled turn, that's actually okay. Because you're still on the vertical, you're just turning the corner.
Just turning the corner.
Okay. So you're probably okay with that. If you get movement there, it'll be because the frame continues all the way over. We'll have to watch and see how that goes.
Okay.
If that was all masonry, it would not be an issue at all.
Okay. Now I know we're talking about the standards, and the standards are the ASTM C926 and the ASTM C1063. Those are the standards that Mike's referring to that tell us how to prepare the stucco and how to install the lath. So when he talks about those standards, that's what he's referencing. So,
and I'm glad that was perfect timing, because I wanted to go back to this for a minute. There are a couple things. So C926 is how you put plaster onto whatever substrate you have. C1063 is how you install metal lath and accessories. There's another one, C1787 is how you install non-metallic lath and its accessories. Now, there's some changes coming in ASTM in that 1063 group, and we've taken all the accessories out, all the things about manufacturing accessories out of 1063, and created a whole new ASTM standard C1861 that only has the accessories in it, how they should be made, what the requirements are, some example diagrams of what they look like, that kind of thing, and they're somewhat generic in that respect. So there will be a new standard coming out, C1861. It's already been published, but it's not in the code yet. So the way that works is, as we have a standard, we update these standards, and we're working on them constantly, and they get changes about every 6 months. But the one that appears as a reference standard in the code is always 2 or 3 years behind the one we're currently working on. So there are things coming in the new standards, the new versions, the next time the code updates, that are not in there now. And one of them is this: construction adhesive to attach accessories to solid bases. This is not currently allowed by the code. However, it is allowed by the current standard. And it's because we found out this works a lot better than stud nails that everybody was using, okay? So it's much stronger.
What kind of adhesive did they use here?
It has to be an exterior rated, gun grade, non-expanding adhesive.
Okay.
So you can't use foam for this. And you have to keep it very similar to this. You don't want it filling up all of the perforations and that kind of thing. Got a little bit much here, a little bit much there, because the plaster has to go through these perforations and bond to the block. All right, but they've done a pretty nice job of this. Is one of the best I've seen.
This is all going to get filled with stucco.
Yeah, and it'll all get filled with stucco. All right, so that's an example of things that will come. Most everybody already recognizes this as being acceptable, and it's going to be acceptable in the code next time the standards change anyway. So, okay. So this is a good one, and it saves the plaster a lot of time and a lot of headaches. One of the problems we have is the standard actually requires you to use a 3/4 inch stub nail. And a 3/4 inch stub nail, if you put it that close to the edge of that block, will break the block out. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't work. So what everybody's been using is a 3/8 inch stub nail, which doesn't meet the code or standard anyway.
The standard, yeah.
And so this is much better system. So now we're at the front patio here, and we've got a window inset, a masonry window inset into the opening. And there's a couple of things I want to point out here. To begin with, we have a band at the top of the decorative band at the top of the window, and that's fine. It's not an exposed weather surface. It's going to be fine there. But when we get to the bottom down here, and we have another one, and for some reason all the builders do this. They want to bring this top casing bead way up above and then fill all this with stucco, and it slopes like that. The problem with that is where it makes this rapid change, it can tend to crack. And really, the way to do that would be to extend these legs down and move this casing bead down underneath the bottom of the sill so that it all just comes down to it. That would be a smarter way to do that, and it would avoid trapping water in here.
No indifference of materials, so it's not going to crack there.
Right.
And water accumulate.
Right. And so now, the next thing is you can see that this jamb has been, this sill and partial jamb have been treated with a waterproofing, water sealant, I guess is the better way to do that. That's actually a good practice. If you do the face of the jamb, the sill, in fact you can do all the way around the jambs and the head and the sill. But you should not do it on the face of the block, like for instance in here or out here. And the reason for that is this is waterproof. And when you put plaster onto the masonry, it's supposed to absorb the water out of the plaster to pull that cement paste in there so that it can cure and lock everything together. If you do this, it can't absorb that water and it can't absorb that cement paste. So you have a bond issue here. And so if you look at the FMA, the Fenestration Manufacturers, and AMA, which is the Architectural Aluminum Manufacturers Association, if you look at their standards, which are referenced in the code, it will tell you to do the sill, the jamb, and the head, but not the face of the block. Do not put it where it will inhibit the bond of the plaster. It specifically says it that way. So this I would take off, but do the sill, and do the jambs, and do the head if you want.
So now to correct that, they would have to rough that up.
They're going to have to do something to augment this bond. Likely what they'll do is use a bonding agent. Bonding agents are good, but they're not perfect. A dash bond would be better, but here, if they're going to do it, so they're going to have to do something with that, and likely it will be a bonding agent, okay? And that would be acceptable. So here we had a little bit too much adhesive in this area, but it's not terrible, and it's a small area, so the rest of the plaster will hold it in place. Now we have a corner bead here, and the corner bead is so they can make a nice. The problem I have with this is that there's this, the stucco has to be isolated from this window. And you typically isolate it with a plaster stop with a backer rod and sealant. So there's no room for a plaster stop here now. So, and if you put one over it, you're going to get so much web you can't get it embedded properly. So really, this should be strip formed with a plaster stop in here with like this. It should look like that. And taking the corner bead out.
Good point. And then the backer rod will go back.
Yeah, the back. And this, I'm using a piece of
right. Oh, there it is.
A backer rod already on it.
Is, right
so then all you have to do is put a bead of sealant in here.
Good.
It's already set to the right depth and all that.
And
so
this would be to prevent the stucco from cracking and falling off.
It allows the window, and this is a vinyl window, but vinyl moves just like aluminum or anything else. It allows it to expand and contract without putting inducing pressure and stress to the plaster coat. Okay? Now the one up here, they've got it set below. So that's good. So if it's going to weep out the front and the back on that perforated flange, but it's already below the window. So that one's fine. This one just needs to move down about 2 inches. Inch and a half maybe, anyhow. So that you can put the stucco on at the right thickness and slowly taper it and not have any dam at the front of that sill. Okay, so we're on the opposite wall now. You see we have more penetrations here. This looks like, you know, cat cable. Again, we have the wire that can nick that stuff. The wire should be cut back. Putting the foam in here to fill that big void was a good idea, but now they need to put some flashing sealant, like a liquid applied sealant over that. They put the lath on here and you could plaster over that and it'll probably be fine, but still, you know, you got to cut this back first.
Now, with that sealant, like, are you going to group these cables, or does the sealant need to go around each individual
now,
cable?
they're going to group the cables, so this is hard to do.
What's the
so
chance
one of the
of
ways to
water
do that is
getting
to
back
take a
in
piece
there?
of peel and stick and wrap it around there so it holds them all together, and then seal it
and
like
then
that.
seal it. Okay. All right.
We have the same thing here with the outlet box, again, where they've come in, they filled this in to fill the hole behind it. I hate to poke a hole through it to show you, but believe me, there's a big hole behind that. We've got some foam on this one, so they're going to have to isolate this. Now, what they've done is they've put a waterproofer on the wall here because the electrical is stubbing out. And now the problem with that, the electrical goes through the wall in here into the garage. There's a big hole in the wall back here where that conduit or where that electrical wiring goes through. That's what needs to be sealed, flashed and sealed. Water going behind this that gets to that hole can go inside. That's why they do this. But again, when they do this, they're creating an inhibition to the bond of the stucco on that area. So now that's going to have to be augmented somehow. Speak up.
I said done on a single story house that way.
Yes.
This one actually goes up.
This one goes up, and we'll talk about that one when we get up there. Personally, I would like to see these. I would like to see all of this stubbed up inside the wall cavity, inside the block, and run up, so you don't have to deal with any of this. And all you have is the one penetration coming out where it hits here.
Well, actually, with this one, the conduit is coming out of the top and going out.
It's going up and then goes in. I'd rather have it go in the wall and, you know, go up.
Now with this, they're going to stucco all the way around, all the way, and it's going to encapsulate this panel. And so now we're having a problem with the listing requirements for the panel being off the wall.
Right.
So tell us about the proper way to actually do that.
So this again is an isolation issue. The stucco cannot go against this metal. It will rust it, okay? And this is going to expand and contract at a really big rate because it's steel and it's painted gray. So what you would do with this is this kind of thing.
There you go.
All right? So now you've got a termination in the plaster stop and you've got a bead set. Now if you just had the plaster stop, because these come without this backer rod on it, so if you just had the plaster stop, you just set it so that it's that deep all the way around, and you fill that with a separate backer rod and then a bead of sealant, so that it allows that to move. This is done nicely. Having this offset bracket up here helps a lot. Most of the time they would just push that up against it and the guys would have to try to stucco to the edge of that pipe, which it never works. So this way they can actually get plaster behind the pipe, and that's much better. So all in all, this one is not terrible. I've seen a lot worse than this. This is going to get, as long as they put a stop around that and isolate that, it'll be okay. Okay, so you see we have another window now. We have the same issue with the waterproofing on the face of the block. We've got the same issue with the corner bead and no plaster stop, no separation here. There is a nice a bead of sealant around this that will help, but you need more than just that little thin bit to separate it from the stucco. And so to accommodate that movement, that's differentiation of movement. All right, next we have a vent. Whether that's a dryer vent or a bathroom vent, I don't know. But typically these vent caps are designed to go over the top of the stucco and not into it. This particular one could be sealed the way it's designed, at least on three sides. And they've made an attempt to do that. Now that little narrow stuff on the face there, obviously is not supposed to be there, but in this case, the stucco surrounding it will probably hold that in place anyway, and it's not going to be a huge issue. Okay. We have another one somewhere else we're going to talk about when we get to it that's much worse.
Be an issue.
Back down here, there was an attempt made to fill this with foam. Some of it got knocked out. Something needs to be done with this. when we told them to flash this and they came back, this is just fresh, you can see. And they just used whatever caulk they had to do this. That ain't very pretty. And
so that should probably be cleaned up before they do that?
I'd make them do that over again if it was me. I don't like that. We have the
He's got
same
plenty
issues
of
with
sealant,
joints
but he doesn't
being
have
sealed.
any sealant at the butt joints of the weep screeds.
Yeah, we talked about that. Again, the joints in accessories. Again, this one is over the block, so it's probably not critical, but if you're going to do it, get used to doing it basically everywhere. Now I'm going to ask you to turn around and look at the wall behind you, because there's some issues on this wall we don't see on this house. And that is B-holes. We mentioned this early, B-holes and missing head joints. This is a B-hole. It's where the mortar has fallen out of the mortar joint. There's a missing head joint right here. There's no head joint there. These joints are supposed to be 3/8 wide, all of them. So laying out the masonry properly, and I know that's hard to do, and you're always going to have some issues. We'll eliminate that kind of thing. So you get your coursing correct in the right height, because it's a modular thing, and you get your coursing correct in length with a 3/8 joint in between. So what happens here? So we talked about the sponging of the wall. This did not really get done on this wall. If it had, it would have covered these up with a little thin bit of plaster that would not be watertight, okay? And so it looks pretty, but it isn't effective. And the code actually requires that this joint is full depth of the face shield of the face flange of the block. And in Florida, those block, well, that's 1.25 inches. So the mortar should be 1.25 inches deep here, minimum. And obviously it will, I'll show you.
Obviously they're planning on filling that with stucco. Yeah. Nothing.
All right, so it goes all the way through. All right, so now that has to be repaired prior to plastering it. You've got to fix this before you stucco it. Otherwise it'll crack right here, okay? So it will telegraph through the stucco. So the thing to remember is stucco is a decorative coating, and it has almost no tensile strength, and it has very little flexural strength. And so what happens is it's not there to hold the building together. It's there simply as a decorative coating, all right? So you can't rely on the stucco to solve problems like this. This has to be fixed first. There is a specific procedure for doing this. It's called tuck pointing. The methodology for doing that and the mix you use to do that is in the Mason standard, ASTM C270 for unit masonry, mortar for unit masonry. It's all on the back of that standard. So you can find it. Those become issues. I have not seen it yet. These houses are still fairly new, and I have not seen it yet, but oftentimes you'll see a crack that follows the block mortar joints
Stair crack.
like that. They call stair step cracking. Sometimes people think that's a settlement crack, and it can be, but if it's a settlement crack, then the foundation will be cracked too.
As well.
And generally it comes up through a couple of blocks before it starts doing that. So most of the time when you see this, the problem is that when they make concrete block, they're made wet, and they're put into a moist cure room for 24 hours and at 100% humidity, and then they stack them on a pallet and they take them outside. So from the day they come out and go on that pallet, they're as big as they're ever going to be. And from that day forward, they shrink because they're drying out. They're losing volume due to loss of water. So they shrink a little bit. So they go out there and they finally come out to the job site, and they're small and it's hot, and you're coming out here and you're mixing fresh, wet masonry mortar, and you're putting it on that block, okay, and you put it in the wall. So the block is now going to suck the moisture out of that masonry mortar, right, and take the volume away from that. At the same time, the sun's coming up, the wall, surface of the wall temperature is getting hotter, which is causing the wall to expand. So the wall's getting longer and the joint's getting smaller, and that's what results, okay?
Great.
That has to be fixed before you plaster the wall. Now that's an easy fix. They make a lot of, almost every company, paint company makes a patch sealer for this, and Elastomeric has expansion qualities. You fill it with that. You know, you can rub mortar into it, but frankly, I think that doesn't work as well. And then you can plaster over that and it'll be all right.
They're not going to knock any mortar out. They're just going to fill those.
Just going to tuck point that.
Just tuck point
Yeah.
them. Okay.
Yeah.